but I don't have a lot of announcements, so I'm going to turn it right over to Kaiping Chen. Her slides are up already, so you should see them on your slide share. Kaiping is, as many of you know, because some of you are working with her already or know from the literature, she's a faculty member in our department in computational communication research. A lot of her work deals with public deliberation, especially on online platforms, but also public attitudes towards science. Has published in probably all the premier outlets in political science, APSR, POQ, political, Public Opinion Quarterly, and certainly science communication as well. As I said, many of you have worked with her or are working with her on projects on computational social science, and you'll see some of that on the social media side today. But the project she's presenting on, or the data that she's presenting on, is actually really, I've had the pleasure of seeing some of it before. Fascinating data about connecting nationalism to misperceptions and engagement with science. In this case, in the particular case of China, but you'll find out pretty quickly that a lot of the lessons actually will apply to a little bit closer to home for all of us as well. Kaiping teaches classes for us in research methods, in social media analytics, in a whole variety of fields, and so certainly encourage you to check out her work, and today will be your first opportunity to do so. So Kaiping, thank you so much for making time for us, and we're excited to hear the results from the study.
Thank you so much, Chen, for the very nice introduction. And hi, everyone. I am Kaiping. It is my great pleasure to present my work, which I feel very excited about. And I would also love to hear your suggestions, comments. You can put in the chat box, or you can raise your hand during the Q&A session. And so today I'm going to present a series of my research work, which I look into what is the role of nationalism in people's misperception and engagement with science. And I'm going to present to you evidence from a national survey I conducted in China last year, and also my social media analysis on those very popular social media sites in China. So we know that there is a lot of misinformation spreading on social media. For instance, from a lot of the controversial science topics, such as debating about whether GMO is safe or not, to the issue related to us about the politics. So this is a picture which they talk about a conspiracy, which believed the US soldiers brought COVID-19 to China, when they attended the World Military Show. And then we also see a lot of, things about pseudoscience. So this is a picture from the group lab where they advocate for people can use this kind of energy to gain, fitness and wellness in life. So there are a variety of misinformation we encounter in life. And a parallel with the spread of misinformation is also a continuous, theme of the nationalism. So nationalism is not a new topic to us. It started, go back to as early as the World War I to the 1950s when the US and Russia engaged in the Cold War, to the nowadays where we see there are a lot of the attitudes people have in terms of like the Kung flu, where people talk about who is responsible for the COVID-19. And also nationalism also fits under the bigger picture of what we think about the in-group and out-group hatred, such as a lot of the white supremacy, like the Proud Boy in US. So it is an issue, it's a global issue, and it's a continuous problem facing us. So nationalism and misinformation are not only the two core concepts which are fundamental for communication and social science research, but also they matter to us as human beings in terms of how we view the world and treat other human beings. So this is what motivates me to do this of research. So nationalist attitudes such as pride and solidarity can unite a nation during crisis, but it might also exacerbate intergroup hatred and foment the spread of conspiracy. So the effect of nationalist attitudes, it can extend beyond political issues, as well as we see a lot of the things debate about COVID-19 pandemic, where people talk about, oh, which country is responsible for COVID-19. And also in the recent vaccination nationalism, where we see people try to brag about, oh, whose vaccine is more effective. And however, despite this kind of the empirical importance of nationalism and misinformation, there are very little research, look at the role of nationalism outside politics, especially in people's knowledge about science and science misinformation. So there are anecdotal evidence in our life which we observe that this kind of nationalist attitude might have facilitated the spread of misinformation. There are lack research works trying to theorizing and empirically testing the relationship between nationalism and people's science misperception and engagement. So here are the major findings from my research work, which I want to deliver today. So the first message I want to deliver is, one's pride in national identity, it is not often associated with more misperception about science. It is the out-group devaluation that boosts one's misperception across all science issues, from people's understanding about controversial science to people's epistemic knowledge of science and to conspiratorial beliefs. So the second message I want to also deliver is like out-group devaluation can also decreases one's certainty about their knowledge of science. So it's not just about their belief accuracy. It also makes them less confident about their knowledge of science. So the second thing is, we all live in a media environment where, it's very highly fragmented. So what I found from my work is people's exposure to social and legacy media can amplify the role of nationalism on science misperception. And then the final message I want to talk about is nationalism not only can have cognitive consequences like influence our perception about science, but also have behavioral consequences. So I'm going to show you from my social media analysis today how the nationalism can affect how people engage with conspiracy and debunking messages on social media, from their click behavior to the quality of their discourse, how they talk, have dialogue with each other. So these are the key message I want to deliver today. So I'm going to first talk about how we can use social identity theories, which is a very classic theory in social psychology. How can we use that theory to understand what is the relationship between nationalism and misinformation? And then I'm going to present my evidence from a national survey in China to show you how nationalism can influence people's misperception or perception of science. And then from the social media analysis I did, I'm going to present evidence to show you, what is the behavioral consequence of nationalism in terms of people's click behavior and the discourse quality. And finally, I'm going to talk about the implication about how we think about misinformation correction and deliberative citizenship. And I also invite you to have a discussion about these points. So first is about a social identity approach to theorize the relationship between nationalism and misinformation. So I'm going to talk about, how do we think about a variety of science misinformation, and how do we understand the different layers of nationalism. And then I'm going to tell about, how can we use this classic theory in social identity to think about the relationship between two. So first is about the knowledge of science and misinformation. So there are different indicators scholars have raised to measure one's knowledge. So the first two you see here, content knowledge and epistemic knowledge, are what they call as science literacy. So content knowledge is whether one holds correct information about scientific facts. And epistemic knowledge is more about whether one understands how the science works. For instance, some people believe pseudoscience. Some people, don't understand what's the probability theory or hypothesis. So this is about how one understands how the science works. And then the third thing here you see here is called conspiratorial thinking. So they differ. This one differ from the science literacy. So this is a conspiratorial thinking, is a willful rejection of science. And it often focuses more on those identity facts, like focus on, the us versus them worldview. So it stresses a lot about the group conflict. So these are the different types of science knowledge we want to think about. And then in terms of nationalism, it is also important to think about the kind of several elements. So nationalism, we want to distinguish between the in-group pride and from out-group derogation. So nationalism is not always a negative thing. It's not just about out-group derogation. One's pride in their national identity there is a positive side of nationalism. So the in-group pride, or sometimes scholars used to call it patriotism, it is conceptually and empirically distinct from one's aggression, devaluation against the out groups. And it also, those kind of in-group favor doesn't necessarily result in one's out-group hatred. So this calls for the importance of when we study nationalism, it's important to separate these two dimensions. And then also important is nationalism can be grounded in different identities. So the ethnic nationalism is more focusing on nationalism based on one's ethnicity. I believe my ethnicity is better than yours. And for the second type is called civic nationalism. This is more about one's pride in the nation as a whole. And there are also two sub-dimensions. For instance, one's pride in the nation. I love my country. It's different from I love the ruling party of the country. And then the third, one is the cultural nationalism, which is more emphasize one's identity, proud, based on one's, tradition, culture, different rituals. So this is where the nationalism, it can ground it in different identities. So the key message here is we also want to think about them differently because they reflect different identities we can think about. And these different identities could influence misperception of science differently. So this is a picture which we can help us think about how we can theorize the relationship between nationalism and misinformation. And there are two very core theories in social psychology which can help us think about the relationship. One is the self-affirmation. The other is the identity protective cognition. So the self-affirmation is more focusing on, oh, I'm very proud of my identity. And then the identity protective cognition, in a very simple word, it's focusing more on, I am better than you. So these are the two psychological mechanisms which could influence how people think about science. And also, which you see I put in a green box, this is the high media choice environment. So people live under this kind of fragmented media. We can't live without this kind of bigger environment. So this is where these two psychological mechanisms also operates, we need to keep in mind, under this bigger media picture. So first, look into the self-affirmation. So this is more in a simple sentence is, I'm proud of my national identity. So there are some of the scholar works showing that one's self-affirmation affirm one's own value. It might reduce one's need to respond to those threatening information because those people feel more confident about themselves. Then they might feel no need to deny the outside threatening information. However, majority of the research show that this kind of proud of one's identity, this type of self-affirmation can actually increase one's motivated reasoning. So they might selectively expose themselves to the information which affirm their current views. And also their empirical work shows that those kind of in-group favoritism, one's proud of their own group's identity, can actually misguide their opinion on other groups in terms of stereotypes and discrimination. So from this self-affirmation theory, I developed a hypothesis as participants are more likely have a higher level of misinformation when they have a stronger degree of pride in their national identity. So this is the self-affirmation part. I am proud of my identity. And then the second is the identity protective cognition. So this is in a simple word of the psychology of I am better than you. So when people have this type of identity protective cognition, so they will develop defensive reaction to new information in order to protect their identity, to protect the worth of themselves. So under this case, people will begin to dismiss, deny, or even distort the new information when they think this information is threatening their self-worth. And we also see the empirical works, show that this type of out-group hatred can result in biased perception toward media and political parties. And in the science context, we see that many online narratives also kind of, spur those kind of out-group hatred, such as, terming the COVID-19 as the Kong flu. So this motivates me to develop my second hypothesis that people are more likely to have a higher level of misinformation when they have a stronger degree of this type of out-group derogation. So it's more about, comparing to you, I am better than you. So then putting this self-affirmation and this kind of out-group devaluation under the bigger picture of the media environment. So we see that this kind of the problem of nationalism and misinformation, they can become even more salient in this kind of high choice media environment. So people can choose what media to use for consuming information and how frequently they use the media. So media exposure has been found to affect people's knowledge about scientific information, and they also be found to also affect people's degree of political polarization. But in terms of about misinformation, misperception, there are debate among the scholar whether what's the role of the media. Do they just play the strengthening the role of nationalism on misinformation, or they play a minimal effect, or actually they are a decisive effect? So it's kind of a lot of debate going on in the literature. So this is where I raise as a research question, how does the media choice can moderate the relationship between nationalist attitudes and misinformation? So this is the theoretical framework which drives my research work, where we see that how these two fundamental psychological mechanisms, what role do they play in people's misperception and perception about science, and how these two mechanisms, self-affirmation and identity protective cognition, how can they be influenced, under this kind of high choice media environment? So I conducted a national survey in China last year to understand people's level of nationalism, their level of science misperception, and also their media choice behavior. So this survey was fielded last May to July. And this is the sample distribution of the people who participated in my survey. So we see that, when doing this survey, it's an online panel. I try to make sure that there is gender balance. And I also try to, make sure there is a certain, amount of people who are across different education level. And I also care about, how many people from urban versus rural area. And this is also the average income. So I try to do is for this national sample, although it's online, I try to reach as diverse group as possible. And then in this survey, here are some of the independent variable and dependent variable. So for the independent variable, I ask a lot of questions about people's nationalism. And as I mentioned before, it's very important to separate one's pride in one's identity, such as the words pride in nation, pride in government, culture, and ethnicity, differs them from their out-group derogation. So I asked them a bunch of statements, rating from 1 to 5 scale, to what extent they are proud of the Chinese government, to what extent they are proud of the traditional Chinese medicine. So these are a variety of questions about pride. But I also ask very similar questions about out-group derogation. But the difference between the out-group derogation question and the pride question is, for instance, these are the two cases of out-group derogation. So I will ask people to rate from 1 to 5 to what extent they agree or disagree with this statement. Chinese medicine is more effective than Western medicine. Chinese people are more intelligent than Western people. So these are the questions I also ask similarly in the pride, but in the pride questions, I will just say Chinese medicine is effective. But I won't say Chinese medicine is more effective than the Western medicine, because I want to kind of fully separate one's pride in identity versus, oh, I'm better than you. So these are the independent variables which focus on, different types of nationalism. And for the dependent variable, I ask people a bunch of questions about different statements regarding their knowledge, different type of science knowledge. So I ask a bunch of questions about their content knowledge, such as, whether people believe GMO can lead to low fertility. And I also ask a bunch of epistemic knowledge questions. For instance, whether those people believe that one's blood type can decide one's personality. Those kind of pseudoscience questions. And I also ask questions about people's conspiratorial thinking belief, such as, it's the American soldier brought COVID-19 to China. So for these questions, I ask people to rate from 1 to 5. 1 means they believe it's definitely false. And then it goes to likely false. I don't know. Likely true. Definitely true. So the reason I design in this scale is, first, I want to know about people's belief accuracy. To what extent they hold a misperception about these different types of knowledge. But then you see, I also designed this into, definitely false, likely false. This is for me to measure people's belief certainty, which measures, how confident they are about their science perception or misperception. And then I have other, alternative control variables. For instance, for the media exposure, I ask people questions such as, how often do they use different media for science information, legacy media, social media, word of mouth, etc. And I also ask them a bunch of questions regarding their trust and also ask their demographic, characteristics. So now I'm going to present 2 very interesting findings from this survey. So the first finding is, I found that pride in national identity is not always associated with more misperception. It is the outgroup derogation. It boosted, increased one's misperception on every type of knowledge. So let's look at the figure here. So for this figure, you see 3 panels. Each panel represents a type of knowledge. So the first panel here, plot here, is the misperception of content knowledge. And the second is their epistemic knowledge. The third is people's conspiratorial belief. So then the plot plots the coefficient of the regression models, which predict what's the association between nationalism and the dependent variable, people's misperception of different knowledge. And also, we see here, there are different pride here, and we have the downgrading outgroup here. And these are the questions regarding those trust questions. And this is the science exposure question. So this is the partial, figure of the full regression model. So the main thing, very interesting thing, what stands out in this figure is we see that there is a positive association between people, the level of people's outgroup derogation and their misperception in GMO, in the epistemic knowledge of science, and in their belief of COVID-19 related conspiracy. So do we see that the more one hates, devalue the outgroup, the more one will hold misperception on every type of science knowledge, from their science literacy to their conspiratorial belief. And then I also see that, for the pride in national identity with these variables, I see that there is a heterogeneous relationship. They have heterogeneous relationship with my dependent variable. By heterogeneity, I mean that we don't see that all the pride gonna make people have more misperception. But what I found here is the pride in culture, which make people have more misperception about content knowledge such as GMO, and also make people have more misperception about the epistemic knowledge. So then you might say, so some of the measurements in my pride of culture, it contains statements of asking people whether they promote traditional Chinese medicine. So this is where, people who promote traditional Chinese medicine, they advocate a lot about the natureness, and it is usually against the genetically modified food, these things. So this is where it's kind of an interesting thing is, it's not always every identity pride which can boost people's misperception. It is certain types of identity which can influence people's misperception. And then for this picture, what I look at is, I look at the relationship between outgroup derogation and one's confidence level, certainty level about their knowledge. So what I see here is people's certainty level also decreased when they downgrade outgroups. So this is where we see when people have more outgroup downgrading, it decreased their knowledge, certainty level, confidence level in terms of their knowledge about, not only GMO epistemic knowledge, but also conspiratorial beliefs. So they become less certain about the perception they hold. And then looking into, the role of the media exposure on how it, influence people's misperception, or how it moderate the relationship between nationalism and people's misperception. I found that, media exposure, it is not directly associated with one's misperception of science. It moderates the relationship between one's nationalism and science misperception. So there are two kind of the interesting things when I examine the interaction effect between media exposure and one's nationalism. So the first is here we see that when one exposes more to the legacy media, it strengthens the positive association between one's outgroup derogation and misinformation. So it strengthens the relationship. What makes one of those people who hate, the outside group, it makes them hold more misperception. It is the same also true for social media. So I also see that, social media also amplifies the role of particularly one's ethnicity identity on people's misperception. So what is the takeaway from this survey study? So my work argues the importance of integrating this very critical politicizing vector, nationalist attitude, into the misinformation research in order to understand how people form their misperception and perception of science. So by infusing nationalism into thinking about and discussing science, science can turn from apolitical into political. So I see that nationalist attitudes, especially one's outgroup derogation, it increased the people's misperception on every type of knowledge. And it also makes one less certain about his or her science perception. And we see that media exposure, this bigger environment variable, it can also amplify the role of outgroup derogation on people's misperception. So we talk about that, nationalism, we see that, it plays a very, very important role on people's misperception, right? On their cognitive, information processing process. So the social media analysis works I have done, trying to understand, how does this kind of nationalism, language, how does that what's the role of it in public engagement with science messages on social media? So to study this, the first question we want to ask ourselves is, how do we understand public engagement with science on digital media? So for me, when I approach public engagement with science on social media, I was actually looking at three types of things. So the first is matrix. So these are the public engagement behavior from those passive consumption behavior, like the number of views people have on a message or on a video, to those active participation, like number of retweets, number of comments, number of hashtags. So these are what I call the matrix behavior, click behavior. And then the second public engagement kind of thing, I understand that is about in terms of the network. So this is a network which shows, whether to what extent a message goes viral. It's about the structure of how far the message diffuses, how many people it reached. Does it follow a broadcasting pattern, or it follows a more kind of the in-depth pattern? So it's more about the network structure in terms of the engagement. It's not just about the click behavior. And the third element I understand about public engagement with science is I look into their discourse, how people have dialogue with each other. For instance, in terms of the tone they use, To what extent they use those uncivil language, and also how do they deliberate about this information? What type of justification do they use justification? And if so, what type of justification do they use? Facts, alternative facts, personal stories. It's more about how people weigh the importance, pros and cons of a message. So these are the three things in my social media analysis work I put in mind when I understand public engagement with science in the digital media environment. So the first study, the Weibo study, is Weibo is a very, very popular, it's almost the second popular, social media sites app people use in China. It has over 500 million monthly active users, and it covers people, from different, background, gender, demographics. A lot of people use Weibo to get to get information. We can think about Weibo, it's like the US Twitter. So for the Weibo study, this is me and my collaborator. We look into COVID-19 related posts, which are posted from 215 million users from January 1st to April 30th, 2020. So we look into this time period because for China, that's the time where the China experienced the pandemic, the skyrocketing, and then it goes into control. So we look into this time period. And we filtered from all the COVID-19 related posts to those 7,000 posts, which are originally crafted. So it's not about retweet. It's just the originally crafted, conspiracy related posts, which focus on talking about the origination of COVID-19. How does COVID-19 happen? Who is responsible for it? Is it happening by nature, or is it happening in the lab? Is it deliberatively made, or unknown origin? So when we look into these 7,000 posts, the independent variable and dependent variable we look into is, for the independent variable, we look at one thing which is very related to those nationalist language. It's called responsibility attribution. So it's about who do they blame? In the message, do they blame COVID-19 to the US or to the China or to other country? And in the Weibo, majority of the responsible attribution is in terms of China, US-China relationship. Those two countries are the main actors. And I also look into conspiracy types, such as whether the origin is talking about human synthesized, or it's made in the lab, or it's just unknown from the nature. And I also look into the sources cited. And then for the dependent variable, we look into, mainly look into two things. One is about the click data, those kind of matrix user participation in terms of the number of retweets, likes, comments. And then we also look into, we talk about the network, right? The information diffusion, how far away the message go viral can spread out. So the first kind of picture I want to show you is actually a very interesting picture. So this picture, it puts, here are in the top panel, what you see is the volume of conspiracy versus debunking posts, across from January to April. And the text box here is we're also looking to the, Sino-US conflict in terms of the politician level. So we see that, every time there is a conflict, for instance, when Trump called the China virus and the Chinese top officials blame the US soldiers for virus, we see the spike in terms of the conspiracy posts. And then when the Trump tweeted that he should stop using the term China virus, we see there is a spike in the debunking amount of posts. And then we also see that conspiracy posts also spike when the Trump issued the green card ban, and when the US, talk about the policy of the 5G clean pass on Huawei. And then the same pattern also goes, we also see there are a spike of blaming the United States as responsible for COVID-19 when Trump called the China virus, when Trump issued the green card ban, and when it initiated the 5G clean pass on Huawei. So this picture doesn't talk about any correlation or causation, but it gives us a sense of, this kind of nationalist, this type of nationalist language, and the conspiracy, the volume of conspiracy and debunking, they go hand in hand with the bigger media environment, with the Sino-US conflict geopolitics. And then this is regression, part of the regression table, we try looking into the association between, responsibility attribution and my two dependent variable, participation and the information diffusion. So what catch your eye in this, table is we see that when a message, when a post blame China or blame United States as responsible for COVID-19, when it is kind of use those type of blaming language to talk about the responsibility attribution, those type of message received more retweets, and it also received more information diffusion. It also goes more viral on the Weibo. So this is the Weibo study, which we see that, this type of nationalist language, it is, put under, it goes, it happened when we observe there are a lot of kind of the geopolitical conflicts between countries. And we also see that, it can affect how people engage with this type of message, on the social media. And then the final piece of evidence, very interesting, I want to show you is the identity discourse. This type of identity discourse not only exists among the general public, the lay public on Weibo, but it can also perpetuate the science-savvy community. So this is where, I look into the platform called Zhihu. So Zhihu is a very popular Q&A platform in China. So it is like the America site, like the Quora, where you can ask questions, usually a lot of the questions related to knowledge, related to science issue, and then people give answer to you. So for instance, one of the most popular issue on Zhihu people discuss over the past 8 years is about GMO. It is constantly discussed on this Q&A platform. And also a lot of the people who use the Zhihu platform are those people who are interested in science, or at least passionate about science. So they are not the lay public. They are more like what we call the science savvy, public. And I collected all the GMO questions from 2011 to 2019. I collected all of the questions and all of the answers to those questions. And for the GMO issue, the identity, language shows in this kind of picture. So these are the two most iconic figures regarding GMO issue discussion in China. So the top part is a very famous TV host who is anti-GMO. And then the bottom is a US, is a university, very famous university professor, scientist, who is pro-GMO. So a lot of the discussion on the Zhihu platform, they actually put them into two groups. I am the pro-GMO group. I am the anti-GMO group. And when they name their group name, they will say, oh, I am this, I am the TV host follower. I am the scientist follower. So they give their group, they will use those type of group language. So this is the main independent variable I look into. And then I also look into, the public engagement here. I look into the quality of people's discussion in terms of to what extent they use those uncivil language, and also to what extent they use justification when they share their answers. So this is a picture which compare those answers who doesn't use group language versus those answers, Zhihu answers, who use the group language. And then on the y-axis is the average number of incivil words used per answer when we compare these two groups. So we see that, compared to the non-mentioning group, those answers, when an answer mention group, it uses more words regarding disgust. So disgust, this is where we apply our, Chinese dictionary regarding the incivil language. And we do a lot of validation to validate this language, to validate this dictionary. And we see that when people, use this type of group language, try to distinguish themselves, from the other group, they actually use more angry words and also use more disgust words. So they will also call the other group, like telling them that your guys' IQ is so low, how can you even not understand the benefits of GMO? So they use a lot of downgrading language when they blame the other group. But then very interestingly, when I look at the justification, whether people use justification, use any type of facts, different sources when they leave their answers, I find that, for those people who use, group language, they also use more justification. They cited more evidence. It could be scientific evidence, but it could also be alternative sources. And sometimes they tell personal story. Sometimes they cite statistics. So for those people who use group language, they also use more justification. So this is an interesting thing which we can think about is when they try to defend their group or to downgrade outgroup, they also use more, justification, try to argue a lot in their answers. So what is the takeaway from these, studies, on the social media and the survey? So the first, the theoretical implication. So how my works speak to social identity theory. So we see that, identity can translate beyond the political misinformation to the science misinformation. And the nationalism, especially outgroup derogation, could increase one's motivated reasoning in interpreting the science information and in how people engage, argue, debate about science. And in nationalism is an important politicizing factor particularly in the post-normal science age. And we see that in-group favorism, it doesn't always result in science misperception. So this is why most literature, they find that, when people hold those in-group favor, it can increase people's biased information processing. But my research showed that pride doesn't always result in misperception. We need to ask ourselves, what pride? Based on what identity? So this is where, I argue for the importance for us to decompose nationalism based on different identity and to look into this nuanced, heterogeneous relationship between different identity and different types of misinformation. And then the second thing is the moderating role of media exposure. So more exposure to traditional and social media can amplify the association between outgroup derogation and misinformation. So this echoes with a lot of the literature about how the fragmented, how high choice media environment, how they strengthen politicization. And some of the practical lessons, implication for science communication. So first, about misinformation correction. It needs to attend to people's different identity when you try to correct people's misinformation. So for instance, one type of inoculation strategy scholars have been studying is you might want to warn people about those identity-based misinformation. And also those communication, you need to attend to people's value systems before you do the correction. And it's also very important because of this kind of nationalism attitudes, emotion. It's very important for us to, listen to each other, to cultivate deliberation and dialogues. So another promising sign, unexpected sign from my survey is, I see that those who have more outgroup derogation, they are also more ambiguous in their beliefs. So this means they might be more likely to be persuaded. So this kind of provides some of the hopes that for those people, yes, they hold more misperception, but they are also less confident about their perception. So thank you so much, and I very much look forward for your comments and questions.